Flowers are one of the most important parts of our natural world. They support pollinators and help produce much of the food we rely on. But despite that, most people never really look at how they're built. Hi, I'm Marshall, and welcome to the Wonderful World of Plants deep dive into flowers, structure, and organization. Before we get too deep, let's look at a map of where we are going to explore today. We'll start off with what a flower is, then we'll look at the main structures of a flower, what makes a flower complete and what makes a flower perfect. We'll look at the plant sexual systems. This is how the male and female flowers are distributed across plants. And then finally, we'll end with a brief excursion into inflorescence. So, with all that said, let's dive on in. Let's first talk about what a flower is. So, in angiosperms, that's flowering plants, the flower serves as a site of sexual reproduction. Angiosperms have two main methods of reproduction. There's asexual reproduction and then there's sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is done through propagation methods like air layering or cuttings and results in the new plant being exactly the same as the mother plant, basically a duplicate. Then there is sexual reproduction, and this takes place in the flowers. So you have the male structures in the flower and the female structures in the flower, which combine, usually resulting in a seed and leads to a lot of genetic diversity. So now that we kind of have an understanding of the importance of flowers in the sexual reproduction of angiosperms, let's look at the different parts that make them up. Don't worry about memorizing all of these because we will go through each one in their own respective light. So let's start from the bottom. First, you have the peduncle, then that leads to the receptacle. You have the sepals, the petals, the stamen, which is the male part of the flower, and that's made up of the anthers and filament. Then you have the female parts of the flower, the pistil/carpel, and we'll discuss that more as well. But those are made up of the stigma, style, and ovary. So up first is the peduncle and the receptacle. These two structures have a lot to do with each other, so I thought it was fitting to discuss them together. So the peduncle is not only a funny word to say, but it is an important structure because this is a specialized stalk that supports the flower. The receptacle is the enlarged part of the stalk, and this holds the entire flower together. The flower is usually whorled around it, which basically means it's arranged circularly around the receptacle. Up next is sepals. Sepal is a modified leaf whose main purpose is to protect the unopened flower or bud. These are usually small and green, but sometimes can be indistinguishable from the petals themselves. A sepal is the singular leaf that protects them. A collection of sepals is known as the calyx. A good way I remember sepals is by thinking of carnation flowers because the calyx or that collection of sepals is very prominent in carnation flowers. It's almost like a green vase leading up to the petals. Up next is petals. Petals are very similar to sepals in the fact that they are both modified leaves. However, petals are showy, brightly colored, that real wow factor to the flowers. And this is because the purpose of petals is pollinators. The main function of petals is to attract pollinators. So a single modified leaf is the petal, but the collection of petals is known as a corolla. And a really phenomenal fact about petals is that the architectural design of them is based on the pollinator aesthetics. So a great example of this is with milkweed and butterflies. Milkweed flowers are very tubular, which makes them a perfect flower for butterflies because they have a long straw-like mouthpiece known as a proboscis, and that tubular flower makes it easy to stick their proboscis in and drink the nectar. So this isn't in the diagram, but I definitely felt it was worth mentioning. Tepals or tepals, depending on how you pronounce it, is when the petals and the sepals are indistinguishable from one another. So they kind of all just look exactly the same. And some great examples of this are tulips, magnolias, and daffodils. Stamen, the male structure of the flower. So the stamen is made up of two parts. The first is the filament, which is a long, skinny stalk that holds the second part, the anther, and this is where pollen is produced and eventually dispersed. And lastly, the pistil slash carpel. This is the female reproductive structure of the flower and has three parts. First is the stigma, which is the sticky area atop the reproductive structure, which catches pollen. Then there is the style, whose main purpose is to elevate the stigma into a more favorable position to catch those pollen grains. And then at the base, you have the ovary, which encloses the ovules, and the ovules contain the female reproductive cells. In most diagrams, you will see the female reproductive structure is labeled as simply the pistil. And the same thing goes for a lot of literature. It'll just list the female reproductive structure as pistil. If there is mention of the carpel, it is used almost as an interchangeable word for pistil. However, this isn't 100% accurate as they are two different things. In the female part of the flower, the whole structure overall is called the pistil, but inside that structure, we find smaller units called the carpels. The carpel is made up of three parts. That's the stigma, which receives the pollen, the style, which kind of elevates that stigma into a more favorable position to catch the pollen, then the ovary, which contains the ovules. So a carpel is the one complete reproductive unit with those three parts, the style, the stigma, and the ovaries. And the pistil is the full structure, and that can be made of one carpel or multiple carpels fused together in the flower. Let's go back to this diagram now that we have a better understanding of what each part is. So you have the peduncle, which is that modified stalk. You have the receptacle, the enlarged area of that modified stalk where the flower is whirled around it. There's sepals that are modified leaves, whose main purpose is to protect the unopened flower. You have petals that are showy and bright that attract pollinators into the flower. You have the stamen, the male reproductive parts of the flower. That is the filament, which is the long stalk, which holds the anther, and that is where the pollen is produced and eventually distributed from. Then you have the female reproductive structures, the pistil and carpels, and that is the stigma, which is the top and that sticky part that catches the pollen, the style, which puts the stigma in a more favorable position to catch that pollen. Then you have the ovary at the base of that, which houses the ovules that hold the female reproductive cells. That was a lot of definitions and terms we just went through very fast, as well as the broad overview of the major flower parts and their primary functions. I will have a link to that diagram, so please feel free to download it, use it as a reference however you need it. It's a great thing to have. The link will probably lead you to our Substack where that diagram will live and you can download it there. But while you're there, feel free to check out some of our plants we love but don't know why weekly writings we do. They're a lot of fun and a cool twist on learning about plants. Um, but yeah, so shameless plug over, and let's dive a little deeper into flowers. Now that we looked at the basic structure of a flower and identified the major components that they can have, we can start classifying them based on which of these parts are present. And this kind of falls into two different groups. There's complete versus incomplete, and there's perfect versus imperfect, and we'll talk about each one separately. Complete versus incomplete flowers. For a flower to be considered a complete flower, it needs to have four structures. I like to call these the core four. That's sepals, petals, stamens, and pistil. If you remember back, the sepals are modified leaves which protect the flower before it bursts open. The petals are also modified leaves, however, these are brightly colored and they attract pollinators to the flower. The stamen is the male reproductive parts, and the pistil is the female reproductive parts. If a flower is missing any one of these, it could be missing, the sepals, it could be missing the stamen, it could be missing any combination, but as long as it's missing one, it is not considered a complete flower. It would be an incomplete flower. A great example of complete flowers are lilies and why they are used in so many diagrams, including the one we made. Perfect versus imperfect flowers. I will say there is less criteria needed to be considered a perfect flower versus complete, but there is a big crossover between the two. So, to be considered a perfect flower, it's pretty straightforward. the flower needs to possess both male and female reproductive parts. That's the stamen and the pistil. If the flower is missing either the stamen, the male reproductive parts, or the pistil, the female reproductive parts, then it is not perfect. A great way I like to remember this is I think of yin and yang, because yin and yang are the representation of perfect balance or perfect harmony. But it's more because there's yin and yang, which are two factors, and that equals perfection. And then in perfect flowers, there's the male and female structures. That's two factors, which equal perfection. So two equals perfect, essentially. So complete and perfect, side by side, I find very interesting because, to be complete, you need those core four, or the sepals, the petals, the stamen, which are the male reproductive parts, and the pistil, which are the female reproductive parts. But to be perfect, you only need the two reproductive parts, that stamen male and the pistil female. And it leads to an interesting conclusion based off this classification. And that is that flowers can be perfect, but not complete. But a flower can never be complete without being perfect. Maybe there's a metaphor in there somewhere, but either way, it's my favorite fact about flower classification. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about plant sexual systems. This is the classification of plants based on their male and female flowers, that kind of perfect flower criteria. And there is three main classifications that fall within this plant sexual system. First up is hermaphroditic, and these are plants which have flowers that contain both the male stamen and female pistil reproductive parts within the single flower, or simply known as a perfect flower. A great example of a hermaphroditic plant is hibiscus. The second is monoecious plants. These plants have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. So you'll have one group that is the stamen, and then you have another group which is the pistil, that male group and the female group. A great example of this is corn. Corn has a male flower, also known as a tassel, which grows at the apex of the stalk. And then they have the female flowers, known as a silk, which grows at the side or lateral buds of the same stalk. Lastly is dioecious plants. This group has separate plants for their male and female flowers. So on one plant, you'll have your stamens, your male flowers, and on another plant, you'll have your pistil, your female flowers. A great example of this is hollies, that genus Ilex. And probably the best way to tell, and the easiest, between if it's a male holly or a female holly is that the females have those red berries. One last part. A very common flower arrangement is multiple smaller flowers grouped together into a larger structure called an inflorescence. We're going to look at some common inflorescent patterns along with examples of those patterns, and then we'll wrap this whole thing up by looking at some flowers you might not have known are actually inflorescences. There are heaps of inflorescent patterns, so we'll just look at a few of the very common ones. There's umbel, and a great example of that would be milkweed. Panicle, and that's plants such as oats. Capitulum is my favorite flower, and that would be zinnias. And then there is raceme, and that's snapdragons. Some flowers you may not have known are inflorescence. There's hydrangea, and different species of the hydrangea genus have different inflorescence patterns. Orchids, a bit of a more obvious inflorescence, but I think those beautiful flowers really draw your attention away from any identification. Like the hydrangea, they have different patterns depending on the species. And then there's sunflowers. I always found this extremely surprising, but the sunflower head is actually made up of many different or many smaller florets. And there's ray florets and there's disc florets. And this is a capitulum inflorescence pattern. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this deep dive. Today, we dove into what a flower is, the structures of a flower, what makes a complete and what makes a perfect flower, the plant sexual systems, that's the distribution of male and female flowers on a plant, and then we wrapped it up by lightly exploring inflorescences. There is a lot there, so maybe we'll dive into that in another video. Thank you very much for joining us on this deep dive into flower structure and organization. A link to that diagram labeled with all the different parts of the flower is in the description. Also, check out our Substack for weekly writings about plants we love but don't know why. That link is also in the description as well as in our bio. Each month has a theme that is revealed in our Plant Roundup video that comes out on the last Friday of every month. Follow us on Instagram at Wonderful World of Plants for updates. Check out our weekly writings on Substack and stay tuned here on YouTube for more deep dives. Thank you all again, and remember, plants are way cooler than they let on.